This is All of It. I'm Allison Stewart, live from the WNYC studios in Soho. Thank you for spending part of your day with us. I'm really grateful that you're here. Coming up on the show today, actor and comedian John Early discusses his directorial debut, his film debut, Maddie's Secret. The directors of a new documentary about Peter Asher reflect on the musician and the producer's career. And we'll discuss the film Blue Heron, about a family grappling with a son's troubling and potentially violent behavior, which brings us to our first conversation. What happens when you're afraid of your own child? That's the subject of a recent Intelligencer piece by journalist David Brenner Davich. She spoke with parents. Did I say it right?
Julie Davich.
Julie Davich. I'm so sorry. She spoke with parents who share stories of enduring violent outbursts from their children. One woman describes barricading herself in the bathroom to escape her 15-year-old son. Another mother recounts having to fend off an attack from her 7-year-old daughter while the family was driving on the highway. Those parents share that they felt guilty, ashamed, and isolated. We've seen it on screen in the films We Need to Talk About Kevin and more recently Blue Heron, but it is a problem that is all too real. The piece is titled The Quiet Shame of Fearing Your Own Child. It is by Julie Davich, who joins me now in studio. It's nice to meet you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And you've been very gracious about me saying your name improperly. You'll correct me if I'm wrong, Julie Davich.
Yes.
All right. What inspired you to look into parents dealing with violent children?
Well, first, I just want to say thank you for having me. And thank you to you and your producers for seeing the potential in this story to be part of a larger conversation. So I think you can see in the writing of the piece, and people have said to me in the writing of the piece, that there's a personal element there. And there is. I've experienced some of this a little bit myself. Mm-hmm. I'm a mother. I have 2 children, a 7-year-old son and a 5-year-old daughter. And we're mostly on the other side of it now. But because I've been dealing with this, I've had so many conversations with so many parents over the last 7 years, you know, starting when our kids were 2, 3, 4, I'm in parent groups. And you know, my child is screaming at me how much they hate me, or, you know, texting each other pictures of scratches or bites. And there's a lot of things that people don't tell you when you become a parent. And this is one of them, that's, 2/3 of toddlers engage in this kind of behavior, and it's very normal. And then about 10 to 20% don't outgrow it, and they continue to struggle with it. And so the moment that I decided to write about it was in December, and I dropped my kids off at school, and I ran into another mom, and we decided to get a coffee. And Nick Reiner, the news about Nick Reiner's suicide or patricide, had just happened. Yeah. And so we were talking about it. And that was very different than our personal experiences. But we talked about the fact that, we both had various versions of this in our life and nobody talks about it. And it's sort of this quiet secret you carry around. And I just decided that I wanted to write something to bring it into the national conversation, hopefully, and help these parents know that importantly, it's not their fault. And I was grateful to New York Magazine. I pitched it to them. And because of the news around Nick Reiner, they had wanted to figure out a way to cover that story. And so just kind of the timing worked out. Yeah,
for if people are Nick Reiner and they don't remember, he was charged with killing his parents, Rob and Michelle Reiner, about 6 months ago. What was your process for finding people who were willing to speak with you about this topic?
So the crazy thing is that I think when a lot of writers do write these kinds of parenting stories, and they'll start by going to the psychologists, so I interviewed psychologists at the Child Mind Institute and CAPA, which stands for Child Against Parent Aggression in the UK, and then they'll do those interviews first. And then I think they ask those psychologists to recommend people who they're treating who might be willing to speak. I didn't have to do that. I had enough people in my own network, first degree and second degree of separation, because I've been having so many conversations and with so many people. I knew both of these people or knew people who knew them. And I reached out to a lot more to have conversations, and between busy working mom schedules and navigating the challenges of this kind of behavior, or I would, people would say, yes, I'm interested, and then kind of when I would follow up to schedule, kind of wouldn't get back to me. So I had a lot of that. But I'm so grateful to my subjects. And, even though I told everybody we're going to change your names, we're not going to include any identifying factors, these were the two that ended up talking to me.
What kinds of violent outbursts did the people you spoke to, what did they want to discuss? What happened to them?
So I'd originally conceived of this as an article for younger children, like I was dealing with this age 4, 5, 6. And, as I mentioned in the article, it doesn't get a lot of attention because the children are so small. The physical risk to the parents is not that high. You're going to get a scratch, a bite, likely not breaking the skin, a bruise maybe. And so people don't really pay that much attention to it. They pay a little bit more attention to it when children grow up and they're teenagers and they become bigger. So the story that ended up opening the article is of a teenage boy who's a foot taller than his mother, because at that point it becomes, very threatening or risky for the parent. There really is the potential for real danger or harm to happen. So I was really thinking of more the violence of young children that happens because it's not paid attention to. But there's the emotional factor of it too. So even though maybe you got a scratch or a bruise or maybe even no physical mark at all on you from your child going after you, the emotional and psychological toll that takes. You love your child, you literally grow them, raise them, and you give everything for them, and then this happens and you don't know how to cope with it, and you feel like it's your fault because that's kind of what society's telling you, and you don't know what else it could be. One of the subjects in my article says, was it because I sleep trained? Was it, you start looking for reasons like that. But so it's both. It's that the psychological, but also the emotional, the physical and also the emotional. And then the physical gets greater as the kid gets older and bigger.
Yeah, your piece opens with this woman and an older child, and she has to kind of lock herself in the bathroom because of his violent outbursts. For that particular child, were they regular outbursts? Did they happen for a specific reason? Was there a trigger?
Yes, so they were regular. And the trigger was usually the parent putting a demand on the child that for whatever reason the child was struggling to meet. And it was usually just for most kids, most families, just an everyday, do your homework, clean up your room. I mean, she and I had conversations about, go take a shower, telling him to take a shower, and he refused to take a shower, and he had hygiene issues. And it was, there's two sort of diagnoses for this, which I didn't really get into in the article, but there's a profile of autism called pervasive desire for autonomy, PDA, which used to be called pathological demand avoidance, and they've sort of renamed it. And then for children who aren't on the spectrum, there's oppositional defiant disorder. So a lot of it has to do with just having trouble meeting demands that are being put on them and not having the skills to cope with that. So that's usually what triggered it in that particular family, in that household.
We are discussing the Intelligencer piece, The Quiet Shame of Fearing Your Own Child, with journalist Julie Davich. She spoke to parents who shared their experiences raising children with violent outbursts. Listeners, we'd like to invite you into this conversation. Have you ever dealt with a child who had violent or explosive episodes? Maybe you have a sibling who behaved this way, or have friends struggling with their own children. We'd like to hear your stories about coping with children who occasionally behave violently. This is a no judgment zone. Your story might help someone else. You can also remain anonymous if you'd like to call. Our number is 212-433-9692, 212-433-WNYC. That's 212-433-9692. You can join us on air, or you can text to us at that number as well. What kind of research is being done into this issue?
So that was another shocking discovery. So there was a study 20 years ago of, I want to say the focus group was 90 mothers or something like that. I'm sorry, I don't have the number off the top of my head. But that was where we got the statistic that 1/3 of toddlers aged 2 to 4 exhibit this kind of behavior towards their parents. And that was, again, 20 years ago, relatively small group. And it was only mothers were part of that study. Just for whatever reason, that was just the dyads that they were looking at. And then I also cited a study that was just recently published, very conveniently for my story, a couple of months ago, fortuitously is the word I was looking for, that there was this longitudinal study done from this group in Zurich that studied, they focused on teenagers age 11 to 24. The age 11, 12, 13 is really an onset for this kind of behavior. It's really a transition point, a development point where a lot more demands are being put on kids as they're going to middle school. It's one of the ages where this can happen, and that was one of my subjects in my story. That was really where she started to see it increase also. So they studied 1,500 participants over the course of these 13 years, and they found that 15% of 13-year-olds exhibit this kind of behavior. And it might just be a one-off, a one-time incident, but 15%. What was more concerning was that 5% were still exhibiting this behavior in their early 20s. And those are really the only two studies that I could find. And I think that's part of the larger problem here is that there haven't been a lot of studies. There haven't been studies of children, so the first study was children age 2 to 4, and the second study was children age 11 to 24. Couldn't find any studies or statistics on children age 5 to 10, for example. And I hope there will be more.
Anecdotally, what did the people you interview talk to you about? What kind of violence did they experience with their children?
It was really, as I described, like for ages younger children, it was a lot of lashing out, kicking, punching, hitting, throwing clothes or whatever object, slamming doors, turning furniture over, throwing furniture, depending on size and age.
What happened if the parent tried to exert their influence? Say, like, no, please don't do that.
I know. It's funny, it's like they're like, you're bigger than them. This should be. So the twist of this is that when your child is going through this, they're not in their right mind. They're really... they're really struggling. And so when you're a supportive, loving parent who wants to be there for your child, it's the same thing they say, oh, just, lock your child in their room. But in that moment, weirdly, they're looking for connection. They're looking for support. And even though they're lashing out at you, they need you in that moment. And so you kind of have to just make yourself a punching bag, literally, and just kind of let them take it out on you. And that's very hard, but that's what a quote unquote good parent, does in that moment. And yeah, it's hard. And especially as they get older, and then there's really the physical violence. You can't stay there for it. And they are pushing you away even more.
Let's talk to Eugenia in Manhattan, who's called in. Hi, Eugenia. Thank you so much for taking the time to call. All of it, you're on the air. Can we bring up Eugenia?
Yes, I'm here.
There you are. Thank you so much. You're on the air.
Yes, I know someone who has who exhibits this type of behavior. He used to lash out because of family problems. His mother, because she was not a good mother, she was on the abusive side, and even now when he's upset with me, I'm his caregiver. Sometimes it's a little bit like he throws something at me. That goes away. The bruises go away, but the emotional pain that he feels because of what happened years and years and years ago, and I will always feel the emotional pain that he never got over it. It's something that's never ending.
Thank you so much for calling in. Let's talk to Marissa from Williamsburg, who is a child therapist. Hi, Melissa. Thank you so much for calling in.
Hi, it's actually Marissa.
Marissa, I'm sorry. Marissa, thank you so much.
My name's Marissa. And I'm a creative arts therapist. I work with families and children with this particular issue, mainly because the majority of the population I work with is all neurodiverse kids. I was this child. I remember harming some of my friends when I was younger. My son was this child, and, it was devastating to have worked so hard as a therapist to be like, I'm not repeating this cycle, and then watch my son go through it when he was a toddler. So one of the things that I wanted to point out, because, I haven't read the article yet, but just pointing out that right now we're calling it things like TDA and ODD. And while those things can be true, we're only focusing on the cognitive part of missing these skills. So what we know is if the child is in a healthy home and the parents are doing everything they can to really help these behaviors, but nothing's shifting, then what we need to look at is actually the body. And so what I'm finding is that the majority of kids who cannot self-regulate emotionally, it's because they have a sensory processing difference or disorder. And it's something that is so easily treatable with occupational therapy. Like I went from seeing my child scream hysterically for like an hour and a half about things sometimes, to now being able to see like things like, Mommy, my body's really bothering me, or it bothers my ears when you do that. That's why I feel upset, right? And so it's a fun and easy fix that doesn't add shame to the child. And so I just wanted to pop in here and tell people, like, there are methods like CBT and things like that. But at the end of the day, if we're not fixing the body that is dysregulated because the sensory processing cues are off, there's no amount of like me telling my brain to not get upset that's going to stop my body from freaking out. And so I just wanted to give a little information and hope to some parents out there. Find your nearest occupational therapist that does sensory motor integration and start there. Like I know NYU Rusk has a great place, but for a lot of these kids where it continues on into teenagehood, it's because nothing has fixed the sensory system that is deeply in charge of emotional regulation.
Marissa, thank you so much for calling in. What kinds of treatment did you find in your research?
So I think sensory processing disorder is, part of it. I think that might be a little bit too easy of an answer sometimes. I think it can be part of a larger conversation, but so the psychologist that I talked to, talked about parent-child interaction therapy. A lot of it has to do with the way that the family interacts with one another. And so, just like in any relationship, it takes two to tango. And that's not to say it's the parent's fault. It's just giving them the tools that they need to help their child in those moments, and then also prepare them to try to avoid those moments. So parent-child interaction therapy was one. SPACE was another one that was mentioned to me. Supportive parenting for anxious childhood emotions is what it stands for. Ross Greene's book, The Explosive Child, I believe it's called. Maybe start by reading there.
Someone just mentioned that. This text is, my younger son was, and is still very explosive. The work of Dr. Ross Greene was super important, helping me help my child.
And that book is not specifically about this topic, kids who are explosive towards their parents, but it's about kids who have this personality in general. And some children who are violent towards their parents are only violent towards their parents, like one of the subjects in my article, but some exhibit this behavior in other settings as well. And so each problem is so unique. That's my takeaway. One of the subjects in my article was not neurodivergent. That is a risk factor. ADHD is a big risk factor. Just had severe separation anxiety around transitions and just didn't have the way to cope with it and just needed some talk therapy with a therapist. And now can communicate to her mother when she's struggling. It's really one-to-one to getting to the why of the behavior is what I was told.
We'll have more of this conversation about the quiet shame of fearing your own child. It's an Intelligencer piece by Julie Davich. We'll have more after the break. You're listening to All of It on WNYC. I'm Allison Stewart. We're discussing the Intelligencer piece, The Quiet Shame of Fearing Your Own Child, with journalist Julie Davich. She spoke to parents who shared their experiences of raising children with violent outbursts. Julie, let's take a call. This is Betsy calling from Asbury Park, New Jersey. Hi, Betsy. Thank you so much for calling in. You're on the air.
Hi. Good morning. I was telling your screener that it felt like divine intervention, honestly, hearing what your program was about today. I actually was inside feeling really down and depressed about some big things that have been happening in this exact realm in my life with one of my kids. And I finally was like, I'm going to go outside. I'm going to go in the garden. I'm going to get some fresh air. And I sat down on the hill in the backyard, and I'm like watching the wind go through the grasses. And I hear what you're talking about, and it felt amazing that you were talking about what I'm actually grappling with right now with my young son. And I just wanted to say thank you because that whole quiet shame part means that we're not always necessarily able to share any of this with anyone. And we can be very alone, and that can only end up exacerbating the problem, right, when we're not able to process and share and, welcome other support and things like that. So I'm definitely going to be reading the article. I can't wait to, learn more. And just a little bit of background, my son is wonderful and beautiful, and we love him so much. He's very amazing. He has an autism, ADHD, PDA, and potentially more diagnoses coming down the pike. And I just wanted to say that, despite the fact that my son has been in early intervention services since he was 18 months old, and he's a little over 5 now. He's not the same kid he was when he was 18 months old, and he's not the same kid he was when he was 3, and he's not the same kid that he'll be when he's, 18. And it's hard to get services for whatever issues your kid is having when those things maybe haven't even been diagnosed or acknowledged yet. And a lot of the things that we've been able to put on the radar of medical practitioners is because of our reporting to them. And it's really important to be open and honest despite the shame factor, because that's the only way toward help. And so we're finally getting into a place where it's potentially a really amazing medical team to have long-term eyes on him.
Betsy, you know what? I'm going to dive in here for a second just because we have a lot of other calls. Thank you so much for calling in and sharing your story. That was a really moving call. Did you want to respond to that?
No, I feel that so much. It's so hard to figure out to get the support you need. And, even in the journey of researching this article, I did a lot of things like just Google searching. And the resources that are out there don't pop up. Child Mind Institute is an incredible resource here in New York City. But if you Google, what do I do if my child's hitting me? They don't pop up. And I don't want to name other treatments that do pop up. But I just wanted to say that what I was told is that evidence-based therapy is really important. And so those are kinds of things like space and parent-child interaction, and the Kasdan method was named to me. But, I also, when I was doing my research, I also tried to see if there were any Law and Order episodes about this, because I just think that it's not really depicted. And I found one episode where the parents had been abusive towards the child, and then the child was just retaliating. But there's no Law and Order episodes where it's just a loving home and the child is struggling. You just don't see the depictions out there that make it part of the conversation. And so
it's just harder for parents because they feel alone, like Betsy did, like you did.
Yes.
This is interesting. School-based occupational therapist here. I work with students every day who have this kind of explosive anger. For me, the most important factor is learning how to regulate the nervous system. Another teacher said, as a New York City elementary school principal, I've experienced these behaviors for the past 17 years. The Department of Education is woefully ill-equipped to deal with these behaviors appropriately. The brunt of the responsibility is left to school staff. Did you find that?
Well, like I said, there's two sort of versions of this behavior. It's the kind that only happens at home and the kind that is sort of in multiple scenarios and can happen at school. And I see a lot of posts from parents in Facebook groups talking about, schools just sending the kid home or taking them out of the classroom, and then their education gets compromised, but they're not trained. And Jane Griffiths at Kappa in the UK was telling me that, they should be trained I don't know if they're not receiving training, but and training to support parents as well when parents come to them and are looking for this, because I think it's really a triad more than a dyad. It's the school, it's the parent, and it's the child who kind of need to be working together. And I feel very grateful to my son's school and the staff there, and they're equipped to sort of help us and handle this. Although when my son was 3, I believe, I went to the preschool director and I'm in her office and I'm crying, and she says, "Oh, it's because you're his person, we're his safe place." And I'm just like crying, and she's sort of like, "You just have to put up with this." I think that's kind of but it's a societal problem. So I don't know if we have time to get to outcomes a little
sure.
bit.
Let's do it.
So something I didn't get to in the article is that this behavior is predictive of harmful outcomes in the future. So a lot of these kids, if they don't get the support they need, end up in jail, criminal behavior. And it's a combination of being socially ostracized for exhibiting this kind of behavior, and just not having, again, just the emotional regulation tools that they need in situations. And so early intervention is so important, but society is not treating. I mean, we know that there's no support for mental health like Nick Reiner. Nick Reiner was different. He had schizophrenia and psychoaffective disorder, I believe. And that's not what we're talking about here. But these kids still need help, and it's so hard to get, and it's so expensive. If you're in a rural area, if you don't have the money to afford it, a lot of them don't take insurance. But there's webinars out there. There's YouTube videos. There's this book. Yeah.
There are so many comments regarding your article, and many are explaining their particular circumstances. But every once in a while, there's a comment that's like, permissive parenting is the reason.
Yes.
What's your response to that?
So you need Goldilocks parenting is my takeaway from my conversations and my research, which is that if you're too authoritarian and too harsh, it can kind of doesn't cause this behavior, but can exacerbate the problem that's already existing. And if you're too permissive, I do agree that it can probably exacerbate this behavior. You need this Goldilocks parenting that I think is sort of between the two. And I heard both, that too authoritarian can cause it and too permissive. And so you kind of do have to ride that line in the middle.
We have about a minute left. Is there anything else that you wanted to say about your article, about your personal experience with your child?
I want to talk a little bit about the response that I got.
Okay, got about a minute.
So I didn't read the comments, but I read a few of them, and I just decided not to go there. But I did while I was working on the article, a couple people were like, "Oh, what are you working on?" And I told them, and they said, "Oh, we have this at home. I have this with my son." After I wrote it, people messaged me on social media, "Thank you so much," or came up to me at events that I was speaking at, or and tell me their personal experiences or asking for help. And this is I kind of want to use the word epidemic, and it's really not being treated. So I hope we can kind of help these parents.
The name of the piece is The Quiet Shame of Fearing Your Own Child. It's in the Intelligencer. My guest has been Julie Davich. She's a journalist, and she also started just a Substack. Shout it out real quick.
The Appraisal, about the art world. That's what I write about.
Thank you so much for joining us.